Let me start by paying homage to Salvador Allende and to all the other victims of the coup, of 17 years of dictatorship and of 33 years of pseudo-democracy under neoliberalism embedded in the 1980 Pinochet constitution. Let me also say that in spite of multiple homages being held all over the world, 50 years after the 1973 coup, a dangerous tendency has emerged in Chile. A common sense is being constructed, installing the notion that popular unity caved its own tragic demise due to its mistakes. This tendency, of which even the so-called progressive government participates, chooses to ignore the fact that the Allende government had to face the powerful destabilization efforts of the USA, of the Chilean military, of the powerful media, all in private hands, and of the extreme right-wing business community. In spite of all that, the Allende government increased its voting power from 36.6% to 43.4% at the parliamentary elections held in March 1973, and managed to display an impressive level of results in such a short time, all in benefit of the people rather than of capital. There were constitutional mechanisms to oust Allende democratically, if that would have been the aim. But a bloody coup was the chosen mechanism. The people were not armed and could not defend themselves. So, my question today is, has the time come for social movements in Chile? For 50 years, social movements were recovering strength and fighting against a subsidiary state, which the Pinochet constitution allowed it to intervene only when and where the private sector cannot find profit, while at the same time providing private sector support. They also had to fight against multiple free trade agreements detrimental to the environment and to the Chilean people, while benefiting transnational corporations and national private capital. Those 50 years brought about repression against social movements, increased disparities and worse living conditions. Social sectors turned from basic rights into private businesses. War and pillage against the Mapuche people. Transfer of privatized national resources to transnational corporations, namely copper, lithium, timber, fisheries, etc. Generalized corruption in public and private institutions, including and most especially within the military. Flawed electoral laws, labor organizations virtually destroyed by neoliberalism and repression. Whole spectrum of progressive, corrupt political parties turned neoliberal. All those years, there were sporadic sparks of social upheaval on isolated demands coming from social movements. Accumulated pressure burst into widespread popular struggle in 2019 unmanageable for the elite in power in spite of military support and repression abilities. Women and indigenous communities had a strong participation in this 2019 events. It's important because so far, never before, the indigenous community had marched hand in hand with social movements, labor organization, and others in protesting against neoliberalism. For the first time, the Mapuche flag flew together with the flags of the different labor unions and social movements. Isolated demands were turned into a struggle for change in the structure of power. So there were no isolated demands anymore. This was a systemic demand for change, and a demand for that change to be embedded in the new constitution. Hope was placed on social movements where political parties and institutions had definitely failed. The elite was forced to make concessions and to cool the fire in order to save the Piñera government that was then in power. The state had to accept the request of a new constitution, but drafted by a constitutional convention, not by a constitutional assembly that would have been the democratic way of doing it, and under conditions in which real change was next to impossible. A constitutional assembly with full powers would have allowed it to establish its own functioning rules. Instead, rules were given and had to be negotiated with great difficulties. However, some negotiations were quite fruitful. What were not able to be negotiated was that approval, instead of being by majority, which would have been 50% plus one, approvals had to be done by a 33%, a 66%, giving the 33% the veto power. A minority veto power, which is quite undemocratic. And it was proven to be so. The only parties that opposed this rule were the Communist Party and the Humanist Party. Even though acknowledging the limitations, people decided to accept the challenge with 78% vote to end the Pinochet constitution. They started organizing at all levels and preparing proposals for change. Traditional political parties were defeated when choosing constitutional drafters. The time for social movements seemed near. The right wing did not get 1/3 of the representation that would allow them to reject all popular demands. However, lurking in the shadows were fake independents, fake socialists, and the Frente Amplio, which is the current President Boris' party. They were there lurking in the shadows, limiting the outcome by voting against the people. One amazing thing was that women were so overrepresented by the elected constituents, that some of them had to step back in order to comply with male-female parity. A Mapuche woman was elected president, the first president of the Constitutional Convention. And indigenous movements, not only Mapuche, but all the indigenous communities that still survive in Chile had reserved seats in the Constitution, altogether 17 seats. In the meantime, presidential and parliamentary elections overlapped this process and therefore were held under the old, flawed electoral rules. Social movements lacked strategic leadership, could not overcome obstacles, imposed by these new rules, made mistakes, and were left with no popular presidential candidate. Best option was Gabriel Boric, this Frente Amplio member, a former student movement leader turned into parliamentarian. The alternative was a neo-fascist, right-wing candidate, Cast. Boric won the elections, but only with the support of the anti-fascist vote, because he had not won the preliminary elections. He won the elections in the second turn when everybody was trying to stop Cast. So the anti-fascist movement lent him their votes. He also had the votes of the center-right. But in order to get the votes of the center-right, in order to please them, he did not incorporate any anti-neoliberal change in his program. He too had voted for the 1/3 minority veto before becoming a candidate. So he wasn't very trustworthy. Even though no matter what his government program should have he chosen to comply with it, would have needed a new constitution. Still, he voted in favor of the 1/3 minority veto. Parliamentary results under the old rules and abstentionism gave all the power back to traditional parties that for 33 years had refused any change. The whole political spectrum, from the extreme right to the center left, undertook a terror campaign supported by the media, that, as we well know, is all privatized, with fake news regarding the conventional draft. So nothing was supposed to be good. It was supposed to be very threatening. It could threaten your property, which was not true, of course. In an unprecedented maneuver, parties, now all of them, including the communist and humanist parties, recovered their grip over a constitutional draft, subordinating constituent power under the recently instituted power, meaning the parliament, which means the parliament had superior power over the conventional assembly, causing many of the left to decide to invalidate the vote because they realized the threat that this meant to any semi-progressive proposal, even though progressive proposals would never be able to be complied with because the anti-liberal measures were not in place to make them viable. The conventional exit plebiscite obtained only 38% approval for the new constitution. So the people and the social movements lost a first battle. Hopefully, there will be more fruitful battles to come in the future. Not the next one, though. The Constitution ended by being non-democratically drafted by the right-wing majority in Parliament, and, fortunately, was also rejected by 56% of the votes at the exit plebiscite. Boric put an end to the story, declaring that there were other priorities in the country at this point, rather than going to find a new way for a new constitution. So we remain subject to the Pinochet constitution, to neoliberalism, and to a subsidiary state. No matter how many small changes the Pinochet constitution has had during all these years, still we have these three major locks impeding any progressive process. The weak, hesitant Boric government is being harassed and manipulated by the former Concertación that now makes up most of its cabinet, by the extreme right, and by the armed forces. The armed forces have notified the government that homages to the victims of the coup, of the 1973 coup, are totally inadequate and are not looked at well in the eyes of the military. If that is not a threat, and if that is not a proof that the Boric government is not taking action against these factic powers that impede progress, I can't think of any better example. So, did social movements win the battle against neoliberalism? Not at all. The game is still in the hands of the power that be, starting with the military, the parliament, political parties, now all political parties, because they've all given up on any progressive stand, big businesses, the media, and all those who thrived on the Constitution giving them privileges, the Pinochet Constitution. They want to keep the Pinochet Constitution privileges. Social movements need a process of stronger unity, of improved organization, and of an ability to strategize, which failed in the last few months. A revolutionary leadership that was lacking in earlier stages needs to be built. A popular educational campaign is necessary. The worldwide recognized example of the popular unity government and the extraordinary, though very limited program that in the first constitutional draft can be rescued, can become the banners for much needed unity in substance and in organization in the battles to come. So, this is not the end of the story. As Allende said, history is ours and is forged by the people.